Hi everyone, welcome to week 9 of science fiction. I hope everybody is doing well after our spring recess, that you've been able to use it to stay caught up not just in our class but your other classes as well. And I just want to give a reminder before we get started with everything with our class. If at any point between now and the end of the semester something comes up that's going to you could in some way impact your performance in the class, please reach out to me. You know my email address, jellis@citytech.cuny.edu. Remember, I have my office hours on Wednesdays from 3 until 5 p.m. The link is on the syllabus to the Google Hangout. But any way that I can help you guys be successful, keep me in mind and reach out to me. And even if there's just questions I can answer about the class or about CityTech, if I don't happen to know the answer off the top of my head, I can try to find out for you. So use me as a resource to help you guys be successful. Now, for this week's class, we got a lot of things that we need to get caught up on and get through. So first off, a little bit of housekeeping stuff. Just as a reminder, make sure you're still taking good notes, handwritten notes in your notebook, because you'll be turning in a digital copy of your notebooks. You'll basically be scanning your notebooks into a PDF like you did for the midterm, but for the final notebook, it's going to be everything from the midterm until the end of the semester. So make sure that you're keeping up with that. And if you fall behind, when you get a chance, watch the lectures, get those notes made, and have them ready. Now, besides having a good notebook, and paying attention to the lectures and doing the readings, obviously all of this is going to be preparing you for the final exam at the end of the semester, which is going to be a take-home final exam. I'll give you a lot more details about it later on, but it will be something that you handwrite, but you're going to be able to use the notes that you've made up until the end of the semester as a reference if you need them. I'm hoping that you're going to remember a lot of this stuff and you'll be able to get through the final exam very quickly and it won't take you a lot of time. But you will have that opportunity if you need to rely on all these notes, your weekly writing assignments. Any of these things can be a resource to you. But the main thing to get prepared for that point is to go through this process of listening to lectures, doing the readings, becoming science fiction experts, learning about science fiction and how it relates to our world. Also, keep in mind that you ought to be working on your research essay by this point. I believe earlier in the semester I had showed you all the list of science fiction definitions that I put together for students. I'm going to relink to that in this week's lecture post. It's on the Science Fiction at CityTech Open Lab site, which you can access easily on your own, but just in case, I'll give you that direct link to the definition sheet so that you can make use of it on your research essays, because you can use some of those as your sources. I give you the quotes, I give you the parenthetical citations, I give you the bibliographic reference for the work that quote comes from. Although, one thing to keep in mind with that is I made that worksheet a number of years ago, and so all of the references, the bibliographic reference for each of those works is actually in the older MLA style. In our class we're using the most up-to-date MLA style, which I'll give a link to when we get a little bit later in the semester, the Purdue OWL MLA website that you can use as a resource free of charge online. But you will need to reformat those as part of your work. I think I've gone above and beyond to provide you with all these different definitions from a variety of different sources, from a variety not only of science fiction writers but also science fiction theorists and researchers that you're going to be able to make use of. So that's most of the housekeeping stuff with our class right now. And again, as we get closer to the end of the semester, I'll talk more about how the research essay should be formatted, how you're going to be submitting it, and the same is true for submitting your final notebook and doing the final exam. So I don't want you to freak out at this point. It's just I'm trying to remind you what you need to be doing now so that when we get to the end of the semester, when I tell you all the details on getting this stuff turned in, you'll be prepared for it. Now, one thing I do want to tell you about that's extra credit is I'll also give you a link to this Open Lab site for the Literary Arts Festival. This is an annual event at City Tech. As you can see in the photo here, in the past it was something that we would have done in person, but because of the pandemic this year it's going to be online as a Zoom webinar. Now, if you have the time and you want to earn some extra credit, all you have to do is go to this link that I give you, and there's a link right here at the top of it for the Eventbrite registration. You register with your name and email address, and they will email you the Zoom webinar link so that you can join us when it is on Tuesday, April 13th at 5 p.m. And it runs about maybe 2.5 hours. But this is how you get your extra credit. First off, you got to go to the Literary Arts Festival, so you have to attend. After having attended it, all you got to do is write me 250 words that you just put into an email addressed to me, jellis@citytech.cuny.edu, but 250 words telling me about your experience attending this year's Literary Arts Festival. The special guest at the end of the event is going to be a performance by Stacey Ann Chin, a very well-regarded artist, writer. But throughout the program, there's going to be musical performances, there's going to be readings by other City Tech students about their experiences during the pandemic over this past year. It's going to be a really outstanding program, I think. And I'm going to be there working behind the scenes, helping out. But I would encourage you all that if you have the time, attend this, see what other students are doing and what they're experiencing. I imagine you're going to find a lot of similarities with your own experiences. But you can just go if you have the time and want to be a part of the life of campus. Even though we're all kind of in different places right now, that's great. But also, if you want to get that extra credit, you can do the 250 words about who you heard, what you learned, what things really stood out in your mind. Make sure you get names down. Show me that you're actually there. Who are these people that were involved that you listened to? And just be making notes while you're attending it. I mean, that's the whole idea of this, is more practice with this kind of work that you're going to be able to use in the workplace and as a student. But 250 words about your experience there. And what this will count for is it can take the place of one of your weekly writing assignments if you happen to miss one or you want to skip one. Or if you've done all the weekly writing assignments, I can apply those points to one of your other assignments. So let's say with the final exam, you were to miss a couple of questions. Well, I can put this credit toward that to help you out. And basically what I'll do is I'll figure out what's the best place that helps you out the most. Okay, so this is a good opportunity, and it's a way to support your fellow students at City Tech and to be a part of the things that are going on, even though the pandemic is keeping us apart right now. All right, so with the remainder of class, we have a lecture to go over for the second part of Golden Age of Science Fiction, and then also we'll talk a little bit about science fiction film. Because for this week I asked you also to have watched Forbidden Planet on archive.org. And I'll tell you about some other science fiction films that led up to that point. And then at the very end we'll just discuss homework, which is going to be your next readings. We're looking ahead to the New Wave SF, and then also your weekly writing assignment about the lecture and the readings so far. All right, so why don't we first off kind of cover where we've been in the class, so that if folks are falling behind or need a roadmap to kind of see where we've been up to this point. I've been wanting to repeat the highlights of what we've talked about and the readings that we've had so far in the class. So we began with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1818, the first work that we can confidently say in retrospect is science fiction. Then we learned about proto-SF of the 19th century with writers like Edgar Allan Poe. And again, your Jeopardy question, make sure you know how to write his name, Edgar-Allan-Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and in France, Jules Verne. Then we turned our attention to scientific romances of H.G. Wells in the late 1800s and early 20th century. And of course, the critical response to Wells in E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops in 1909. We discussed pulp SF and the origins of the term science fiction in the pages of Hugo Gernsback's April 1926 Amazing Stories as Scientifiction, Scientifiction. And we read some examples of stories from that era with E. Doc Smith and Lee Hawkins Garby's The Skylark of Space and C.L. Moore's Shambleau, before also discussing other pulp SF writers including Edgar Rice Burroughs and H.P. Lovecraft. Then we talked about Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, and the SF film serials before watching some of the 1936 film serial of Flash Gordon Space Soldiers. Then last week we began Golden Age SF and discussed John W. Campbell Jr.'s editorship of Astounding Science Fiction, which later became Analog Science Fiction and Fact, and still published to this day, over 90 years now. We read Isaac Asimov's robot story titled Reason, and Ray Bradbury's groundbreaking novella The Fireman, which was revised and later published as the anti-censorship novel Fahrenheit 451. And then, of course, today we're going to continue with Golden Age SF and also talk about SF film. So let's begin. Make sure you get these names and the birth and death dates in your notes for Robert A. Heinlein. And in your notes, you can mention that the A, his middle initial, stands for Anson, A-N-S-O-N. But the way that he's usually credited as a writer is Robert A. Heinlein. And he was born in 1907 and died in 1988. So a little bit of background. Robert Heinlein was educated at the University of Missouri and the U.S. Naval Academy, Annapolis. He served as a naval officer for 5 years before being discharged after a lengthy hospital stay due to tuberculosis. He then studied physics at UCLA for a time before beginning to publish science fiction in 1939 in John W. Campbell Jr.'s Astounding. Robert Heinlein was the first Grand Master of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, and he won 4 Hugo Awards for Best Novel. So the Hugo Awards are one of the big awards given out each year to the best writing, best art, other categories, and they're awarded by Worldcon. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. But Worldcon is like the big science fiction convention for fans that's held once a year and is held in a different city somewhere around the world. And anyone that is a member of Worldcon, meaning you buy a membership to attend the convention, basically you get to vote in whoever is going to win the awards that year. And so for Robert Heinlein to win 4 Hugo Awards for Best Novel is kind of a big deal. Now, next to Campbell's editing in Astounding Science Fiction, Heinlein's influence on the development of the science fiction genre as a writer was equally significant. And these are the 6 main characteristics of his work that I'd like you to get in your notes, and you see them here on the screen right now. So first is future history. Campbell published Heinlein's schematic for his future history in 1941 in Astounding. This future history set out diagrammatically, meaning like a picture, the stories that Heinlein had thus far produced, those he was to write, and some left unwritten. Heinlein's approach was an entirely new idea about storytelling that let readers understand the bigger picture of the writer's intended trajectory. It helped create a core group of fans that felt like really invested in this writing that Heinlein was doing, because it's like, not only were they reading it, but they could kind of see like where it was all going because of this future history diagram. But he largely abandoned his future history by 1950, and he went off to write other things. Second characteristic is hard science fiction. Hard science fiction. While Heinlein is artful about blending science into the narrative, he devoted a great deal of energy and thought into using sound scientific and engineering principles in his stories. So what is hard SF? Hard SF was defined by Alan Steele, Steele, in the New York Review of Science Fiction in 1992 as, quote, hard SF is the form of imaginative literature that uses either established or carefully extrapolated science as its backbone, end quote. Very few stories actually pass muster as true hard SF. Third characteristic is a self-assured writing style. It was said of Heinlein, quote, that he blended slang, aphorisms, technical jargon, clever understatement, apparent casualness, a concentration on people rather than gadgets, and a sense that the world described was real, end quote. For example, in his 1942 novel, Beyond This Horizon, he writes, quote, the door dilated, and then just moves on with the story. As if like, all doors should dilate, like your eye and iris like is able to close and open in a circle, dilate. He doesn't stop to explain why or how. He leaves the cognitive work, the imaginative work of what that means for a door to like open like a circle and then suddenly close up on itself, to the reader to figure out, relying on us to be able to imagine what it is he's writing about. Then in the story that we read for today, All You Zombies, is a great example of this too. Unlike Wells, who spent a whole chapter of the time machine explaining how it works, Heinlein knows that he does not need to do this. If he had, his readers would have been bored because they already knew what a time machine was from previous science fiction stories written by other people. What had happened is that the concept of the time machine had entered into what Damien Broderick calls the SF megatext. The megatext is the shared terms and ideas and concepts that constitute a genre like science fiction. Similarly, the Western or detective megatexts will each be different than the megatext for science fiction. And one of the things about being a reader of these different genres, the more reading you do in it, the more you're going to pick up and learn what that megatext is. Then the fourth characteristic for Heinlein's writing is didactic father figures. Didactic is a great word for you to learn if you don't know it already, but it means to teach, to mentor. So a didactic father figure is someone who's like, teaching you things and is someone you look up to. These can be surrogate father figures or fathers in disguise who serve as the voice of Heinlein himself in the story. So there's these didactic father figures. Fifth characteristic is politics. Political conflicts and viewpoints are often an important part of Heinlein's stories. His own politics, right-wing anarchism or libertarian mixed with ideas of social Darwinism, come out occasionally, most clearly in his novel The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And then finally, the last characteristic is sexuality. Unlike other science fiction writers at that time, such as Isaac Asimov, Heinlein writes about sex frankly. Some of his works depict polyamory and even incest. So it packs a lot of different aspects of sexuality into his novels and his stories that a lot of other writers at that time just simply didn't do. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of his significant works that you ought to at least recognize the names of. First is By His Bootstraps, a short story published in 1941. And By His Bootstraps was published under Heinlein's pseudonym. Make sure you get this word in your notes. Pseudonym, pseudonym. It means like a pen name, a made-up name that an author uses essentially to hide their true identity for a variety of reasons. Maybe because, in his case, he's probably publishing a lot of stuff, maybe in the same magazine. And so instead of it showing like, 2 stories by Robert Heinlein, one would be by Heinlein and one would be from his pseudonym. That, over time people would learn that these were being used by an author, but maybe at the beginning they wouldn't realize this. So Heinlein published By His Bootstraps under his pseudonym Anson MacDonald, Macdonald. And By His Bootstraps is another time travel story in which a character essentially pulls himself up by his bootstraps, to use that phrase, to become a king in the future by enlisting his past self to do the things necessary to bring about his rise to power. The second story here is called Waldo, another short story from 1942, and it's about a crippled inventor living on a space station who uses remote control appendages to do work, hence the name for the subsequent technology. And so for some of you that are studying electromechanical engineering, where you might be using manipulators to do work that like a human being couldn't, because you're manipulating something dangerous, that technology is called a Waldo because of Heinlein's story. That word that he used for the character in the story actually got carried out of his story into the real world when people would talk about the technology that this Waldo character had invented. The third work I wanted to mention is Starship Troopers from 1959. Starship Troopers. And this is about the training and deployment of one Johnny Rico to fight an insect-like alien species known by the derogatory term the Bugs. This story popularized the idea of the Space Marines, but without actually using that term. Heinlein had done that in other stories and adopted the idea from earlier writers, including Bob Olson, who first used the term in a 1932 story in Amazing Stories called Captain Brink of the Space Marines, and as well as E. Doc Smith's Lensman series, which also mentions Space Marines. The novel Starship Troopers, won the 1960 Hugo Award. Very popular. Fourth work I wanted to mention is Stranger in a Strange Land from 1961. And this novel is about an Earthman named Valentine Michael Smith, who is raised by indigenous Martians and returns to Earth. Through Vincent Michael Smith's eyes, we see the horrors of consumer culture and conservatism. Smith, with his psionic powers and innocence, transforms into a messiah-like figure, offering humanity the power of grokking, Grokking, before he discorporates. The novel explores politics, religion, and consumerism, and it won the 1962 Hugo. And that term grok, or to grok, is a term that Heinlein had coined, meaning to like completely understand, to completely internalize an idea that you have shared with others. And so you may see bumper stickers, for example, that mention grokking. That's where it comes from. The fifth work I wanted to mention is called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Mentioned it a minute ago. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And it's from 1966. And it's about a lunar colony's revolt against an exploitative Earth. And definitely explores politics. But this is also where we get the acronym TANSTAAFL. 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 Anybody guess what that means? TANSTAAFL? You ever heard of it? It stands for There Ain't No Such Thing as a Free Lunch. And then this novel won the 1967 Hugo. And the last work I wanted to mention before we get to All You Zombies is Time Enough for Love from 1973. This is one of several novels and stories featuring the character Lazarus Long, who had been known in other stories as Woodrow Wilson Smith, who was the longest living human being ever. You probably picked up from the name Lazarus from the Bible. Time Enough for Love explores the adventures and ennui, E-N-N-U-I, the supreme depressive state of Lazarus Long from his distant past into our distant future. And it won the 1974 Hugo and Locus Awards. Locus magazine is a trade magazine about the science fiction genre. It doesn't publish stories, it publishes news and interviews with science fiction writers, but it also gives awards each year for what it considers to be the best science fiction. Okay, so this brings us to All You Zombies from 1959, which we read for today's class. All You Zombies was Heinlein's last short story. And after he wrote this short story, he just focused on novels thereafter. As you can see here, this was, make sure you make a note of where it was published in and when it was published, in March 1959 in Fantasy and Science Fiction, or the full name, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Sometimes we'll say it abbreviated F&SF. But in your notes you should put the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, March 1959. And as you know from your readings, but to go over this to make sure that everybody kind of follows along, and also to give you guys some more background in what's actually taking place in the story and how this relates to things that are, I think, now much more visible in the world in a positive way, but were relatively new and weren't discussed in the same way as they are now at that time. But certainly it was things that Heinlein and others would have known about from popular culture and from the news. So the story, All You Zombies, is about a person who, due to being intersexed, I-N-T-E-R-S-E-X-E-D, intersexed, and given access to time travel technology, is their own father and mother. In fact, all of the major characters in the story are this one person at different ages and presenting a different sex pre- and post-sex reassignment surgery. Some terms that we should define to help us think about the story include sex, which is the biology of reproduction. Generally, this means male or female. However, many individuals are born intersexed, or having an ambiguous sex or a mixture of sexes in just their one body. This person is like, in the story, is what is called intersex, which is rooted in ambiguity or duality of biological sex organs in a single person. This used to be called hermaphroditism, hermaphroditism. Essentially, intersexed individuals have both sets of sexual organs in different appearance and stages of development. Connected or perhaps layered on this biological reality is transgenderism. To be transgendered is to have a psychological identity where your biological sex or sex expression doesn't match what one believes or feels their gender to be. Transgenderism may be rooted in biology and includes intersexed individuals, endocrinology, and hormone production and reception genetic disorders. Another term related to this is non-binary, meaning the person doesn't really fit or doesn't feel like that they fit into a single gendered category of like male and female. Finally, transgenderism is rooted in the cultural construction of sex, which we call gender. These are the attributes, characteristics, and tropes that societies create around the sexes of male and female. For example, blue for boy and pink for girl are expressions of gender. They're things that our culture has made up. There's nothing inherent about those things in which particular sex that you're born as. Likewise, makeup is for women and not for men. This division has to do with gender, the cultural idea of sex expression, and not the biological sex one person happens to be. While biological sex is largely unchanging, gender does change over time. And so, ideas of what male and female gender mean today are not exactly what they were 100 or even 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. They've changed a lot over the years and in different ways. Now, before writing All You Zombies, Heinlein was likely familiar with publicized cases of male to female MTF trans women. For example, Christine Jorgensen, who was born in 1926 and died in 1989, was the first widely known recipient of sexual reassignment surgery in the United States. Her case and the publicity surrounding it raised awareness of transgenderism. There was also Roberta Cowell, born in 1918 and died in 2011, who was born as Robert Marshall Cowell, a celebrated British fighter pilot during World War II and later a race car driver. Cowell was the first British recipient of sexual reassignment surgery, and notably, she was the friend and patient of Lawrence Michael Dillon, born Laura, the first recipient of female-to-male sexual reassignment surgery in Britain. So there's these surgeries that exist to allow people to transform their bodies to match the way that they feel on the inside, how they want their sex to express itself in terms of their gender. Now, there's also tragedy surrounding transgenderism that you should be aware of. In addition to the violence leveled against trans and non-binary people, Some scientists have used transgender people as experimental subjects without an established body of knowledge corroborating their theories. For example, Dr. John Money, who was born in 1921 and died in 2006, a psychologist and sexologist who studied sex and gender identity, believed that gender was something that we learned, that it wasn't something that was inherent in like our bodies and the way our brains developed and the way we reacted to hormones in our bodies. Dr. John Money sought to prove his theory in the case of David Reimer, who you see here was born in 1965 and died in 2004. After a botched circumcision, Money used Reimer as a case study in sex reassignment and learning gender. Things did not go well for Reimer, who was reassigned his sex as a girl and raised as a girl. Though before puberty, she began self-identifying as male, having known nothing about her biological past as being born male. David Reimer transitioned to male in his teens and lived a troubled life, eventually committing suicide at age 38. Today, Dr. John Money's approaches and theories have been largely discredited. I bring these issues up because despite Heinlein using them as a way to make his story possible, these people are not simply objects to be appropriated and used for the purposes of storytelling and entertainment. Now, there are some other concepts that I want you to know about in relation to the story. First, there's the Ouroboros. O-U-R-O-B-O-R-O-S. Ouroboros. The Ouroboros is a serpent or dragon that eats its own tail. It represents self-reflexivity, recreating, self-generating, or to borrow another mythical image, the phoenix is akin to the Ouroboros because it rises from its own ashes. Second, there's the concept of solipsism. S-O-L-I-P-S-I-S-M. These are things to put in your notes whenever I spell them out. The concept of solipsism is the idea that we can only be sure of our own mind. The external world and the minds of others are unknown to us. This seems to be the main character's take on the world. He is only certain of his own mind. And third, the zombie. The contemporary idea of a zombie comes after Heinlein's story in films like George Romero's Night of the Living Dead of 1968, in which zombie is mentioned in the script's direction, but actually isn't said as part of the film's dialogue. It doesn't even mention zombie in Night of the Living Dead. But this kind of zombie is an undead creature that feeds on the flesh, sometimes brains, of the living. If the living is bit by a zombie, they become a zombie. Romero gives Richard Matheson's 1954 novel, I Am Legend, as the source for his inspiration. Matheson's depiction of vampire-like creatures spreading a contagion and the ensuing apocalypse informs the development of the contemporary zombie. Like Romero's movie, there's no mention of zombie in I Am Legend. What might zombie have meant to Heinlein? The concept of a zombie comes to us from Africans brought to the Caribbean and the Americas. They believe that a zombie is a corpse revived by witchcraft that remains under the control of the person who revived it. As a colloquialism, a zombie can be someone who is apathetic, slow-minded, or not that smart. Imagine someone who seems out of it or not aware of what's going on around him. The main character in the story is sure of his identity in life, but he questions all of us other zombies, essentially asking, how did we come to be? How do we come to exist? Now, in the story, the jukebox, do you know what a jukebox is? It's a coin-operated record player that were once quite popular in eating and drinking establishments. And in the story, it's playing a song by Lonzo and Oscar titled "I'm My Own Grandpa" from 1947. It was actually written by, as you can see here, Dwight Latham and Mo Jaffa. And it relates a funny story about marriage and procreation that results in the narrator becoming his own grandpa. You can find it on YouTube if you just search for "I'm My Own Grandpa 1947" or adding Lonzo and Oscar. You'll hear the actual song that Heinlein is referring to. And as you can see on the right here, this is an image from thesimplephysicist.com that kind of explains the time and character distribution of the single character that exists in the story. We have the baby who is a girl, meets the drifter, and travels through these permutations, traveling across these different times in order to impregnate herself, give birth to the baby, and then eventually continue on as a bartender. You study this on your own and see what you can make of it as regards to the story. I think it's quite inventive what Heinlein did with All You Zombies, but it's also, I think, meant to be a brain teaser, something that maybe you can figure out, but also maybe is something that ultimately isn't completely decipherable. But I'll leave that up to you all, and maybe you can write about that as part of your weekly writing assignments. So next, let's talk about Tom Godwin. Make sure you get his name in your notes. Born 1915, died 1980. And Tom Godwin was a fine writer in the Campbellian and astounding traditions. But he published only about 30 stories during his lifetime, and he had a very rough life. Family issues caused him to drop out of school after the 3rd grade. He had kyphosis, Kyphosis, or excessive curvature of the spine leading to hunchback, which shortened his military career when he was older. And to deal with his family and health problems, he turned to drink and became an alcoholic. Now, the story that I asked you to read for today, The Cold Equations, was published in the August 1954 issue of Astounding. August 1954. And it's widely anthologized, meaning that a lot of different anthologies or collections of stories contain the Cold Equations because it's a touchstone for hard SF. It's considered like the best example of hard SF, which I defined earlier with that quote from Alan Steele. Quote, "Hard SF is the form of imaginative literature that uses either established or carefully extrapolated science as its backbone," end quote. So, with this story, you can imagine we're used to the Disney optimistic view of things in most stories or TV shows maybe that we watch. Things that everything turns out okay in the end. But in hard SF, that may not necessarily be the case. While there's always the possibility of a happy ending, any plot development and ending is completely dependent on natural law and any constraints detailed in the story itself. Now, the idea behind the Cold Equations appears in earlier science fiction stories, such as E.C. Tubbs' Precedent in the May 1952 issue of New Worlds, and comic books such as Al Feldstein's A Weighty Decision from 1952 Weird Science. Now, Godwin, when writing the story, tried to give the story a happy ending, but Campbell insisted that Godwin stay true to physical law and the constraints dictated within the story. They went back and forth on drafts until Campbell accepted the published version that we read. Now, the story concerns a distant plant called Woden, with a medical emergency and in need of supplies. A cruiser sends out an EDS, an emergency dispatch ship, with only enough fuel to travel to Woden and safely land with its single pilot and the supplies. Unfortunately, a teenage girl who wants to see her brother, who is stationed on Woden, hides aboard the EDS ship. When discovered, the pilot has to follow protocol and eject the girl from the ship due to the additional mass that she adds to the ship. Allowing for the additional mass might lead to the EDS not having enough fuel to safely land on Woden. After letting her talk to her brother via radio, she is ejected from the ship via the airlock. The cold equations are those that govern classical mechanics and the efficiencies and operation of the EDS and its rockets. I would encourage you to read the story again if you want to dive back into it and try to devise your own way of saving the girl. There's a lot of different ways that people might conjecture that things would allow for the girl to be saved. But I'm going to leave that up to you. You are all the scientists at City Tech. So again, this is something that you could include as a part of your weekly writing assignment if you can come up with a scenario that might save the girl based on what is already in the story by Godwin. And then finally, considering the cold equations of the physical world, the story asks us what can be done to avoid such a tragedy through better design, backup systems, reserves, and of course security, right? All right, so that's the cold equations. Which brings us to the last part of today's class on SF film. So this is something to get into your notes. How does science fiction literature function differently than film? And there's 4 points I want to raise that I'd like you to put into your notes to think about. First is an aphorism or saying by the media theorist Marshall McLuhan, M-A-R-S-H-A-L-L, McLuhan, M-C-L-U-H-A-N, McLuhan. And that is, the medium is the message. This means that the medium of a message, in this case a story, is shaped by the medium in which the story is presented. And if you think about, like a book or a story, everything is done in writing. It's only involving words and adjectives and verbs and adverbs. And we have to take those words into our minds and imagine things. And the way I see it might be different than the way you see the story, based on our experiences and what we know about. But now think about film. It's primarily visual and audio based. What it shows us is able to show us explicitly what the director, the producer wants us to see in regards to the story. We don't have to imagine what the Millennium Falcon looks like in Star Wars. George Lucas showed us what the Millennium Falcon looked like. So the idea here is that these different media are able to transform stories in different ways. And of course, like you're using the Star Wars example, there was a novel based on the original Star Wars film. And if you look at the way that the story is developed and the way things are described, each of these different media are able to do different things based on what we call the affordances and constraints of these different media. Constraints are obviously the things that you can't do with a media or technology. For example, Like, a novel can't show you moving pictures, right? But on the other hand, a film has affordances, that is, things it can do, which is to show you things. But now, if we think of like the novel giving us like the ability to see inside someone's mind by reading their thoughts, that's that's an affordance of books and short stories of writing. But in a film, that usually doesn't work very well. And in most cases, you can imagine the voiceover. Voiceovers are imperfect ways of allowing an audience that access to what's called interiority, meaning what goes on inside of a person. And it's usually frowned upon by great filmmakers and film critics as a weakness, because you ought to just simply be showing us what's happening rather than giving us that interiority in the same way that we can get it from a book or a short story. So that first point is the medium is the message. The second point is that science fiction literature deals with ideas using words. It is analytical. It provides access to that interiority that I was just talking about. Third point, science fiction film deals with ideas by giving them visual shape. It is metaphorical. This makes it more difficult to pin down the meanings of the visual that can be made explicit with words. It deals in surfaces so that we do not have access to that interiority unless the unfortunate voiceover is employed that I mentioned. And finally, the fourth point, science fiction film does things that science fiction literature cannot do, which is use illusion and make the imagined seemingly real. However, it also constrains our imaginations in the same way that listening to a song and then watching the music video can create a jarring sensation. Like if you just heard a song on the radio and then you see the music video, you may already have in your mind an idea of what that song means and like what images you would associate with it, and you see this music video that's like completely bonkers compared to what you imagined in your mind, and it can create that jarring sensation. So on the screen right now I have some movie posters, historical movie posters of early science fiction films. I just wanted to mention that I wanted you to be familiar with their titles and when they came out. So the first science fiction film is by Georges Méliès, one of the earliest filmmakers, professional filmmakers, called Le Voyage dans la Lune, from 1902. Le Voyage dans la Lune, essentially a voyage to the moon. And it's based loosely on Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon and H.G. Wells' The First Men in the Moon. So he kind of took these two separate stories and combined them together to make this film from 1902. The first major science fiction film, second poster here, is Fritz Lang's Fritzlang, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, Metropolis, from 1926. Coincidentally, the same year as the launch of Amazing Stories, if you remember. So this is a German-made film, big budget. It's a silent film, and it's about an artificial life form, in part, but it's also about dehumanization through industrialization, like how the material world and industrial revolution is dehumanizing people and making them like less than human or not considered human. And it's about salvation through humanism, about humanistic principles as a way to lift everyone up. And it's got these very memorable characters. We have Frieder, Maria, Friederson, and Rotwang. Maria is like the humanistic center of the film, and Rotwang, who's like the mad scientist, uses Maria to create a copy of herself, this android that you see in the bottom of the movie poster, who is sent out to essentially incite the working class into kind of a revolution that's going to tear everything apart. And then it's up to Maria and Friederson to then try to regain control over the mob and show them that they're being led astray by this artificial being as controlled by Rodwang. It's a really impressive film that, as far as I understand, there's actually been some recovered pieces that have been added to the film, because you imagine with these very old films, they over time deteriorate, they get lost, and so for a number of years we didn't have access to a complete copy of the film. We knew what went into those parts, but the actual negatives or the film reels were gone. And so sometimes these things do get found, and so that gives us access back to some of these older films. Then next to Metropolis, you see James Whale's Frankenstein from 1931. I mentioned this in the earlier lecture on Frankenstein. This is the film that gives us this enduring image of Frankenstein's monster portrayed by the actor Boris Karloff, who is also well known for performing in a number of monster movies from the early part of the 20th century. And also, I mentioned before, but I'll say it again, the story has obviously been changed from what you read by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, in that Frankenstein is given this assistant, Fritz, who doesn't appear anywhere in Mary Shelley's original film. And also we see Frankenstein's monster, the creature, not really ascending to the level of learning and of being an intelligent being on the same scale as Mary Shelley's creature in Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. Then this brings us up to the science fiction film boom of the 1950s, which corresponds roughly around the time of the golden age of SF. So beginning on the left here, we have The Thing from Another World, also just simply called The Thing, from 1951. And this, even though it's an alien story, it's really about McCarthyism and the communist subversion from within, which I alluded to when we were talking about Ray Bradbury before. Now, the story is based on John W. Campbell Jr.'s short story, Who Goes There, from August 1938, that he wrote under his pseudonym, Don A. Stewart. And so the film, The Thing, stars James Arness as the alien thing, but James Arness, if you're familiar with the name, he would later go on to stardom as Marshall Matt Dillon on the TV series Gunsmoke, very popular show at the time. Then to the right of that, we see The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951, and it focuses on an idealism of a peaceful world through superior might. Aliens attempt to enforce peace over humanity, which is seen as increasingly dangerous due to the development of nuclear weapons. And this film is based on Harry Bates's story, Farewell to the Master, which was published in the October 1940 issue of Astounding. So if you're seeing there's like a trend here, like these movies are being adapted from existing science fiction stories that from writing. To the right of that, you see H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds from 1953, and this serves as a parable of communist invasion, especially the red coloration that's seen throughout the film. It's based on H.G. Wells' 1898 novel, War of the Worlds. It was produced by George Pal, P-A-L, and directed by Byron Haskin. Now, in the film version, instead of tripods, the Martians have hovering attack vehicles, each equipped with a nuclear death ray. It's also worth noting that the renowned film director and actor Orson Welles, W-E-L-L-E-S, dramatized H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds in 1938 as a radio program that, if you're not familiar with it, got people so worked up that some listeners really thought there was an alien invasion going on. They didn't know that it was fiction. They thought that it was an actual news report of things going on in the United States. And so people were going out prepared to go fight these alien invaders. And there was, it became a huge scandal about the way that the story really captured people's imaginations. And then finally, to the right of this, you see This Island Earth from 1955. And this is a space opera that depicts a tension between isolationism and embrace of the other with a capital O. Whether you should just you stay to yourself, or should you try to make a connection with people from other cultures, unlike your own. And in the story, or in the film, uranium is obtained and human scientists are enlisted to help the Metalunans fight the Zagons before their home world is taken. But when it is, the Metalunans attempt to hide on Earth and control the minds of scientists. And it's also based on a novel, 1952 novel, which is in turn an expansion of several short stories by Raymond F. Jones. So in all these examples, these are all based on previously published science fiction. And then that brings us to what I asked you to watch for this week's class, Forbidden Planet from 1956. Okay, make sure you get the full name, get that it came out, it was released in 1956, that it was distributed by MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and that it was directed by Fred McLeod Wilcox. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think maybe before the break, you got to make sure that you're picking things up both in your note-taking as well as the weekly writing assignments. Put accurate spellings of people's names, accurate spellings of titles of stories, accurate dates of publication or release dates for a film. Precision is what you want to aim for, because that precision, even though you may think this is just science fiction class, is something that carries over into everything that you do as you leave City Tech and go into the workplace. That precision is something that reflects highly on you as an individual, as a worker, as a thinker. And when you're not precise, that looks bad. It's a bad look. You don't want that. So, Forbidden Planet, 1956, directed by Fred McLeod Wilcox. This story, or this film, is a space opera interpretation of Shakespeare's play The Tempest, which was written around 1611, and it was first registered with the registering agency in England in 1623. Meaning that's when it's kind of recognized this thing exists. The Tempest, the play, is about Prospero, the rightful Duke of Milan, using illusion and manipulation, kind of like Doctor Strange, to restore his daughter Miranda to her rightful social position and reveal his brother Antonio, who usurped power from him, as being the unmerited Duke of Milan. Caliban is the son of a witch and the former ruler of the island where Prospero has taken command. Caliban is Prospero's servant, but Caliban hates him. He just hates, this guy has this power over him. And so in the film that you saw, it opens with a spaceship landing to investigate the fate of a colony whose sole survivors are Morbius and Altera. The crew is menaced by an invisible Caliban, which we learn at the end of the film is actually Morbius's monster from his id, made possible with Krell technology that eventually destroys its unwitting creator Morbius, who had used that technology to these bad ends. And essentially there's this cataclysm, and Altera is saved and taken away aboard the spaceship back toward civilization. Now, there's some things about Forbidden Planet, which is, I think, a critically acclaimed film of that era, and one that shows how you can create good science fiction from things that aren't necessarily science fiction. In this case, The Tempest, which is more having to do with magic, and it's a stage play considered like great drama. They're able to adapt that into a science fictional setting and story, but they add to it this whole idea about what this Caliban-like monster is. And this comes to us from Sigmund Freud, one of the great thinkers of the 19th century, who introduced the world to the idea of psychoanalysis. And a part of his theories of the human mind and how the human mind is structured is that basically there's these three parts to our mind, what we call a tripartite mind. And so we have the superego. The superego are all the laws and rules that we learn through life. Then if we think of that, it's like at the top, and then at the very bottom, you have what's called the id, ID. And the id is the bodily desires and impulses that we all feel. And so there's a tension, right, between law and our impulses down here at the bottom. And that tension is what creates our ego. I'm sure you've heard that term before, ego. The ego is our sense of self that forms out of that tension between the superego and the id. And what's neat about this, the way they apply this into the film, is that the Krell technology essentially gives Morbius access to all these parts of his mind. It makes him like super smarter than any human being ever. But at the same time it makes his intellect more powerful, it's also making his id more powerful. And all that Krell technology allows his id to manifest itself into this invisible creature that is able to destroy steel walls, and is able to just break through all these barriers, and is unfazed by the weapons that the humans bring with them aboard their spaceship. So I'll also say about that, unlike the other movies I have mentioned before, Forbidden Planet is unique and not based or adapted from an earlier science fiction story. However, it did have a novelization come out prior to release that goes in further depth about the Krell civilization. So again, we're getting to these differences between what we can do with a movie versus what we can do in a book. That with a movie, you can't make. I mean, if you're Zack Snyder, yeah, you can make a movie that's 4 hours long about the Justice League, but usually you can't make a movie that long that people are going to sit through and watch and be able to sell a lot of tickets to. It has to be shorter, so you can have more showings during the day that people don't get bored watching it, etc. So they couldn't fit in all that background about the Krell civilization in the movie. But with this novelization, the novel about the film, then all it is extra pages. Not that big a deal to add those in, because if someone's reading it they may get caught up in it. They may want to learn those things. And so they can fit more things like that background into the book that they couldn't put into the film. And then thinking about the cast and how it relates to Shakespeare's Tempest, we have Morbius in the film, who is like Prospero in Shakespeare's Tempest. Morbius is an obsessive scientist living alone with his daughter. In the film, there's Altera, his daughter, who is like the virginal Miranda figure in Shakespeare's The Tempest. And Altera is on the planet Altair 4. Again, there's like this, the name is being taken to give to this daughter of Morbius. We have Commander J.J. Adams, played by Leslie Nielsen, who you may know from like comedies that he did later in life, but he was a serious actor earlier in his career. So Commander J.J. Adams is like the Ferdinand figure in The Tempest, who is the one that's going to try to save Miranda, take her away from the island. And then there's Robbie the Robot, who goes on to appear in other things like the Lost in Space TV series. But Robbie the Robot is an Ariel figure. Ariel is this like wispy, kind of elvish kind of figure that lives on the island, that's able to do like simple tricks and magic, which we see Robbie the Robot do, but through the technology of his construction. And so I'll just conclude this just for something for you to think about, that applies to, I think all of this in general, but it's not really that deeply focused on Forbidden Planet, is that culture works on us and through us. Stories from the past become a part of our shared heritage. Writers and artists often draw on these shared parts of our heritage to create new art. Sometimes it is deliberate, and sometimes it's unconscious. This is one of the reasons why the artificial constraints of copyright, a recent development largely brought about through the lobbying power of the Walt Disney Company and other media conglomerates, want to own culture in virtual perpetuity, meaning like going on forever. With the speed of culture and technology's change in the 21st century, I see this as one of the next great cultural battles to find a resolution that both respects intellectual property rights for a reasonable time and respects the rights of people to carry on the development of our culture with the art that becomes a part of our shared culture. Again, these are just some things for you to think about, that if Shakespeare's The Tempest was still under copyright, hundreds of years after he had written it, then Forbidden Planet would not have been able to be produced unless your money had exchanged hands with someone that still owned those copyrights. And we see this happening today as copyrights get extended longer and longer periods than they were allowed in the past. But again, your thoughts like that you may have on these things, these are things that you can include in your weekly writing assignment. Because again, I'm just looking for the highlights, the things that stand out to you. You get everything into your notes as you can, but the weekly writing assignment is kind of like the highlights of that, and maybe your own thoughts about things. And of course, you can also use the weekly writing assignment to reach out to others in the class, and you respond to what other people write. Because when you leave a comment, you can also leave a comment on what someone else has written, not just what I write. So looking ahead, next week will be week 10, April 14th. By next week, you need to read week 9. You need to read 2 new wave science fiction stories. We got Harlan Ellison's Repent Harlequin Said the TikTok Man, and Philip K. Dick's The Electric Ant. So there are 2 short stories to read for next week, and we'll begin talking about new wave SF. Of course, make sure that you're working on your research essay. And before next Wednesday, get that weekly writing assignment in. If you have questions about your research essay, please reach out to me. I think everyone that's written to me about their ideas for their topic, I wrote back trying to give you ways of focusing it so that you would have a successful research project. But anybody has questions, runs into roadblocks, needs help finding things, I can meet with you during my office hours, Wednesdays 3 to 5, or you can shoot me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Okay? Remember, we're all in this together. We're making it through as best we can. If you get a chance to get a vaccine shot, please do so. I'm still trying to get my appointment. I haven't got one yet, but I keep trying every day using all the tricks they've been talking about, like on ABC7, to be able to get on the wait list for that. You should be doing the same thing, not just to protect yourself, but to protect others in our communities and those that you interact with. Keep wearing a mask. Try to be healthy, get plenty of rest, eat well, all these kinds of things. And remember that you're not in this alone. We're all in this together. So if you got anything else, make sure you reach out to me. Got my contact information here, jls@citytech.cuny.edu, office hours Wednesdays 3 to 5. But I wish you all the best, and I'll be speaking with you again real soon.